Morning Year 12. It's week 8 of lockdown, and welcome to another instalment of Brooks's Learning Lectures, or whatever we're calling them today. Thank you for all your essays on Bosseler. I've marked all of those and they are coming back to you via email this morning, so that's Friday the 15th. They were on the whole really quite good. There are a couple of elements that I wanted to go over with you, particularly in terms of like Bosseler and sycophancy, and that will lead us quite nicely into the work that we're going to do on context today, because a couple of you had said, could we go over the context please? So lots of you talked about this idea about Bosseler wanting progression in the court, and the only way to do that is to do what Ferdinand says, which is absolutely true, yeah. But then some of you started to compare him to characters like Polonius, in that he's a sycophant and he'll kind of say whatever people want him to get power, which isn't quite true, because remember that Bosseler refuses to flatter Ferdinand, and Ferdinand says to him, I only ever entertained flatterers and panderers till I met thee. Bosseler, says to Ferdinand, you think too much of yourself, and that's your problem. So while Bosseler will kind of do Ferdinand and the Cardinal's bidding to make progress, he refuses to lie to them, he refuses to tell them what they want to hear. And he does that to the Duchess as well. Remember when she's pretending to banish Antonio because he's committed a crime, and he says to her, no, you've done him wrong, and you're going to suffer for that because you've mistreated a good man. Right, which takes us quite nicely onto context. So in your workbook you've got some nice sections about context here. So it goes over kind of biographical context for Webster. Remember, he trained as a lawyer, and we're going to start with James I and this idea about a society that moved away from the more kind of meritocratic approach of Elizabeth I. So James I, while he was quite an experienced king, he'd been King James VI of Scotland for a long time. You might remember this from your Macbeth studies in year 11. He became James I because he was pretty much the only heir left. And while he was quite popular in Scotland, he was unpopular in England, partly because England didn't particularly like Scotland, partly because of fears that he was going to bring back Catholicism, because his mother was Mary Queen of Scots, as you remember, but partly because Elizabeth was so popular, and anyone who kind of came after her wasn't going to be met with a huge amount of welcome and respect. He didn't help himself out by behaving in the way he did. So as you can see in your book, he didn't call Parliament for 11 years. So this idea about he rules entirely on his own. He doesn't take advice from other people. His rules, the decisions that he makes, that's it. And you can see that in the text, where you've got people like Ferdinand who say, no, courtiers should be my touchstone, they should take fire when I give fire, laugh when I laugh. You can see it in the Cardinal, who expects his orders to be obeyed immediately and without question. And this idea of the absolute rule that James I believed in is linked into why Webster sets this in Catholic Italy. So you're right to say that there was this anti-Catholic sentiment, but Webster's using the papacy, he's using Catholicism as a kind of proxy for absolute rule. So what through the Act of Supremacy and the creation of the Church of England, what Henry VIII did was combine political and religious power. And here in the Duchess of Malfi you can see political power in Ferdinand and religious power in the cardinal, and together they are entirely unstoppable. And by creating that setup, what Webster's able to subtly do is criticise a system of rule, which he's seeing in James I and Jacobean society is experiencing, that has absolute power. And this is exacerbated by the fact that James I refuses to listen to anybody else. He doesn't call Parliament, and he only really listens to his favourites. You've also got the stuff in your book, and there is lots of speculation as to whether or not James I was homosexual. Now, that doesn't necessarily matter in terms of what you're going to be writing, but it does go some way to explain the attitude towards James I's favourites. And if you search, just do a quick Google search for James I favourites and political power, you can see the way that those who were within his inner circle really were rewarded in society. And I think Adelaide made a really, really good point in her essay. She had a specific figure about James I having made something like 876 appointments or gifts based on personal collection in the first 5 years of his reign. And it's that kind of specific context that you want to get in there. And that you can all link to the way that Bosseler sees the world and the way that Bosseler behaves. Because for Bosseler, he's not going to get anywhere unless they like him. But he can't bring himself to lie and be that kind of yes man that people like Castruccio are, for example. You also want to think about women. So, yes, women were deemed lower class, or they were deemed inferior within society. But you've also got examples of positive female rulers. You've just had Elizabeth I, who is, for all of her faults, held up as a really positive example of female rulership. Contextually, though, you've got to remember that she kind of disowns her femininity in order to be a ruler. So in her Tilbury speech, which I know we've gone over before, but we'll just recap here about, I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too. And it's this idea about, she takes her body personal, her body natural, and puts it to one side in order to be a ruler. And you can see that in the Duchess of Malfi, where you've got Cariola saying whether the spirit of greatness or of woman reign most in her. You've got comments like, whether I am doomed to live or die, I can do both like a prince. And it's this idea of her body politic being masculine gendered. And that is directly linked back to Elizabeth I and those ideas about you can't be a natural woman and be an effective leader, because of those preconceived ideas about women and their strength. The other thing that you can see in the text is ideas about women being naturally deceptive. So lots of you talked about the focus on makeup, and Bosseler and his lines about the abortive hedgehog and I'd rather kiss a pigeon than one of you. But you can also see it in that fear of the Duchess and her body and the way that the Duchess can conceal her pregnancy. The Cardinal says, to Julia, "Oh, go weep, those self-same tears will fall into your husband's bosom when you do profess you love him best." Looks back. Special for Eliza. I do appreciate a literary mug, by the way. And the Cardinal says, go and borrow that fantastical glass, Galileo's looking glass, a telescope, and look to the moon to find a constant woman there. There's running through the play this mistrust of women, okay? And that's another thing that you want to consider when you're thinking about the text. The other element to remember is that widows were not subject to coverture. So the Duchess, as a widow, has a lot more power than any other woman would have had. Also remember, Juan Luis Vives writes about it is a moral and a human virtue for a woman to remain chaste to the first husbands. But it was also the case in early modern England that women had far more freedoms than they did elsewhere in Europe. Okay, so women. The other thing that some of you touched on and you did quite effectively is this idea about morality. You've got the morality plays coming from the medieval mystery plays. Quite a few of you, I've put a little link. If you touched on this, I put a little link in your essay feedback for some further reading. And so the revenge tragedy becomes, in terms of literary context, this kind of narrative that's about the redemption of the central character's soul, the central character's morals. But what's problematic with that is the idea of a moral framework or a religious framework to start with. So what you know already from your, sorry, I got an email, from your work on Hamlet, is there is this uncertainty around the moral framework in society. You've spent the last kind of 50, 60 years, if we're leading up to early 17th century, going from Catholic to kind of pseudo-Catholic to full-on Reformation and back again, and you're swinging between lots of different Christian ideologies. And with James I, again, comes this anti-Catholic statement, this fear of Catholicism, with the gunpowder plot and all of those things as well. But you've also got that uncertainty about, okay, well, where are we going? Because Scotland in itself had its own kind of Christian traditions, its Christian rules. And as the 17th century progressed, society became more and more puritanical. So the Puritans, as you might know or remember, were a very kind of strict sect within Christianity. And my point here really is that there is no kind of morally certain framework which finds its expression in the text in all of the different ways that people express certainty or doubt about the afterlife or God or heaven. So the only character really who says, I know that I'm going to heaven, I know that God exists, is the Duchess. Everyone else kind of seems a bit uncertain about it. Even the Cardinal in his last scenes comes in reading a Bible saying, I am puzzled about a question of hell. What's the Cardinal doing being puzzled? And if you look at everybody's dying lines, they're brilliant. They're very well worth learning as key quotations. The Duchess says about, pull down heaven upon me. You've got Ferdinand, who talks about whether by ambition, blood or lust, like diamonds we are cut by our own dust. The Cardinal says, let me be laid by and never thought of, which is odd for such a kind of narcissistic character all the way through the play. Bosseler says, mine is another voyage. Oh, hang on. Pause. Post. Sorry. So, thinking about religion, thinking about the Enlightenment, thinking about all of that nihilism within the text, you can link that back to the religious uncertainty of the age as well, that no one knows really where they're going. And as we move towards the Enlightenment period, there is less and less blind reliance on the teaching of religion, which is what you can also see in the text. Other things that are worth thinking about in terms of context, you have got Italian society. So the other reason why the text is set in Italy is not just the Catholic element, but Italian society in general was a kind of shorthand for corruption, for kind of nepotism and political intrigue. If you remember from from Hamlet, sorry, I was about to say Macbeth. Do you remember from Hamlet all that work that we did on Machiavelli and the Prince, and that very much influences the way that people saw Italy. So by Webster setting this play in Italy, yes, it allows him to tap into kind of those cultural perceptions, those cultural norms, and also provides him with a way of distancing his perhaps political criticisms from English society. Hopefully that helps. There's lots, obviously, there's loads more contextual stuff that we will work on. We'll have lots and lots of time to do that. I'll upload a PowerPoint into Frog. I'll also put it on the Microsoft Teams. If you haven't signed up for Teams, you should have an invite email from me through your school account. That's the account that will work. But that would be really useful, because then we can set up some kind of small group discussions. If you want support with an essay with that, I can do a video conferencing lesson there. Other things that are important for you: there's a National Theatre production coming out next week that you must watch. I will set it as your work, but it's an absolute must watch. Hopefully you listened to that Revenge Tragedy radio podcast. I thought it was really interesting. And there are lots of copies of Frankenstein in the post for you this week. Anything else, guys, just let me know. Hopefully get to see you soonish, and some kind of communication. Alright, take care. Bye.